group.
Hi, everybody. My name's Anna Yeager. I am on the collaboration committee, and I'm really excited to introduce Janae Boswell this morning. Janae Boswell is the Director of Education and Partnership for Code 3 Associates, a national training and disaster response organization. She has been in the animal control field for the past 21 years and has extensive knowledge of varied community challenges within animal welfare. She has responded to a variety of man-made and natural disasters, such as the Old Stage wildfire, Northern Colorado floods, 4 Mile Fire, and the recent Marshall Fire. Janae is the president of the Animal Welfare Association of Colorado and serves on the Colorado Pet Overpopulation Fund Board, as well as the National Animal Rescue and Sheltering Coalition. It is a passion of Janae's to share compassionate, thoughtful, and strategic methods to current challenges that face the animal welfare industry, and we are really honored to have her here today to speak with us about this really, really relevant and important topic. So thank you so much, Janae, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Anna. I appreciate that. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for participating and attending this coffee and collaboration. I think this is something that I think has been going on for like the last year or two. And it's awesome to see such a great attendance and relevant topics, and I really appreciate it. So hopefully you will learn a little something today, and we can have some good discussion. I really want this presentation to be interactive. So if you guys have questions, please feel free to pop in the chat, include those. We do have a moderator, so they will interject and we can, get those questions answered immediately. If you have comments or things that you want to share, please feel free to do that. I think this is an opportunity, I open up the discussion, I talk about some topics, but it's really an opportunity for us all to engage. And that's the intent. That's what I'm hoping for. Hopefully I'll be able to wrap it up. My presentation will probably go a little bit longer than the normal 20 to 30 minutes. But I'll try to wrap it up so we can have some good Q&A and maybe some discussion at the end, even some breakout sessions. So let's go ahead and discuss disasters. I really came from it from a field services perspective. I also have an emergency sheltering class that I can provide. But I felt like, it was just more relevant. We're talking about animal control, coffee and collaboration wanted to incorporate some field services aspect. So here we go. Hopefully if I can get it to work. Or it's just going to sit here. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with a poll question. Oh no, it's Rachel, I think it's going to make me launch all three. Okay, we'll just try it, guys. Sorry. So the first poll question is, what best describes your job title? And hopefully it's doing it. Is everybody seeing it? Are you not seeing it?
We can see it, but I don't think it's allowing people to select an answer.
Oh, shoot.
Oh, some people are able to.
Oh, there we go. I'll give it just a minute here. And you guys are just getting these poll questions whipped out right away. Unfortunately, I was trying to break up this thing a little bit. So I just really wanted to kind of get a grasp of who our audience was, what we're looking at. And then I also wanted to check out how many been involved in disasters. All right. Well, we have 31 people that answered. I can go ahead and stop the poll. We have a total of 44 on. And I'll share the results, hopefully. Okay, so it looks like the majority that we have is shelter care workers, which is awesome. And then probably our animal responders and then other. And it looks like we do have one veterinarian, so that's exciting. I'm going to see if I can just kind of hold on to that for my next poll question, if it'll let me. So I think we begin by saying, what is a disaster? Clearly in the picture, this appears to be a disaster, right? What our kind of definition is for disasters is when your department, your agency, your organization becomes overwhelmed with response or sheltering. And it could be man-made and it could be a natural disaster. So we see all of these various tornado, you see the fire, a hoarding situation, and then of course the flood, all of these disasters. So our next polling question, which you guys already answered, is have you ever responded or been involved in a natural disaster professionally or personally? And it looks like 65% of our attendees have. So certainly have experienced, unfortunately, the aftermath of disasters. So what are our phases of planning when we're talking about disaster preparedness? Mitigation, which is minimizing the effects, right? Knowing what we have before we have it, and then preparing for it. Getting those mutual aid agreements, memorandums of understanding actually in play prior to the response, prior to the disaster happening. And then we have our response and our recovery. So what is mitigation? It's an effort to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters. It's planning for the what ifs. So who's in charge during a disaster? We want to figure that out before the disaster actually strikes. What type of situations? Here in Colorado, we're not really going to face any hurricanes. So are we going to worry about that as being an issue? Most likely not. But we sure have to prepare for those wildfires and floods and tornadoes. And then one of the things that I really want to talk about, of course, we're going to go through this resources and what if owners aren't found? Like how do we deal with that? But one of the things that we did years ago, and this was back in the old stage fire and then 4 Mile fire, we knew that there was a flood kind of imminent. And we had always talked about the 100-year flood. It ended up to be the 500-year flood. But we had been talking about that. And after 4 Mile, there was some fallout about the community saying, you guys need to be more accessible to us. We want you to be able to save all of our animals and come out here and rescue us. And we kind of turned the conversation around. And when we did that, we started having these discussions. Boulder County Sheriff's Office, I'm sure Sarah's hopefully is on this call, Sarah Spencieri, but we started having conversations with the community and going out into the rural communities and developing an alternate plan. So we actually put caches in various strategic locations, like at firehouses and other areas, because we knew that we may not be able to get up there to them, but if we provided them with resources in various locations that they could actually get to, then they would have crates and they would have leashes and food and so on and so forth. So I think that was some really good planning that we were able to do, and that kind of put it back on the community that, hey, we can't do everything for you. You kind of have to help yourself. We'll provide some resource, but again, that does fall back to you. So when I talk about the authority, where do we fall within an event? If you look up here, it says incident commander. So that's going to be your head person in charge. And then you look at safety officer, public information officer. We generally fall right down under here under operations. And then we'll have the animal friendly shelter, the human shelter, the animal rescue operations. And that's kind of where we fall within that realm. And then if you look at that, here's that operations section I was talking about. And then here's our animal branch. And then you'll see we have all these various aspects. And depending on the size of the event, these could be tenfold, or they could be teeny tiny. So it may be just a few people running these operations. If you only have 5 animals that you've had to remove from a location, we of course don't necessarily need all these branches. So we certainly, in this mitigation phase, want to account for facilities that we have within our jurisdiction, our area, or region. So what about shelters, veterinary clinics, pet shops, wildlife rehab? What about exotics? That's something that sometimes people don't even think of. And we actually have a big exotic breeder in Boulder, just right outside the city limits in county. And he had this huge warehouse full of reptiles and exotic animals. What are we going to do with that? Does he have his own plan, and he needs his own plan? We can't possibly come in and rescue the day. And I think we found that in this most current Marshall fire as well. There were some boarding clinics or boarding facilities that ended up calling the shelter saying, hey, we have 40 animals we need to evacuate. Can you help? And that is such an influx for a shelter, as you know, in addition to all the other animals that will be coming in that are actually being evac'd out of homes and strays and that sort of thing. So these are all animals that we have seen either out on the road, out in the field, or in emergency situations. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that you're going to see some unusual animals, and you're going to have to prepare for it. And I'm just going to throw this out there. If anybody wants to throw in the chat what this is, I would love for them to chime in. And it's this little guy with the ginormous ears. Okay, so I'm not going to talk tons about sheltering. Like I said, this is going to be more directed towards field response. However, I did want to touch upon the types of emergency animal shelters that we do see. Cohabitated or co-located. I would love to actually be engaging with you guys in person to talk about it. But cohabitated means that you are actually there with your pet. It's most likely a Red Cross shelter. You're there with your pet, and the pet is with you at your bunk or your area that you're staying. So that's cohabitated. Co-located would mean you are at the emergency shelter, and then we have another room or another location that's designated for animals. And so you can still help participate and care for your pet and visit with your pet, but it's not immediately with you. And then we have all these other types of emergency shelters, commercial shelters that we could use, livestock shelters, sheltering in place, which can be difficult, but we have done it on occasion. I think in some situations it's easier just to get the animals out, but in some situations you can't get the animals out. They just won't cooperate. So it's easier for us to throw down food and water, make note that we have done that, and then come back to check on them. So preparedness is actually developing that plan, setting priorities. What are going to be your priorities once an event hits? And you want to go through the whole scale of things. So we may be talking about tornadoes, or we may be talking about fires. And it's kind of finding that plan for any of those instances, or a huge hoarding situation, or a huge hoarding situation that's in the middle of a fire. How do we deal with that? And integrating multiple entities and functions. So the shelters working with your animal control, that's working with your incident command system, and and maybe transportation or Red Cross as well. What type of facilities do you have available? What type of communication do you have? Are you going to go to radios? Do you have cell phones? What if cell phones won't work? How are you going to handle that? So this is a really cool story that I wanted to share with you all about a family that we had during the Boulder floods. And this was a dog and a cat that actually came off a helicopter, and there was no human with them. And there was a group of people, but they said, our neighbor asked us to please, load up their dog and their cat, and make sure that they got to safety. So we unloaded the animals, and on the top of the carrier, which you can't really tell, there was a big note, and it said, please keep me with my dog, Rufus. And then it had a description of the dog. And if you can see down here around the dog's neck, there was, it's almost like a little fanny pack, and it was stuffed with medication and then a note and phone numbers. And so when I opened that up, it said, please keep me with my cat. And it gave the description of the cat. And then it said, please call these people in order of the list. And so I was like, this is the most unusual thing I've ever had. So I make the first phone call and somebody answers. And I said, yeah, I have this dog Rufus and a cat and just came off a helicopter. And they're like, oh, fabulous. That's our friends' animals. They had prepared, so are already planned with other neighbors that if a fire or some other disaster was to happen, the neighbors were allowed to get in the house. They had this all laid out. This was a part of their disaster plan. They put the collar around the dog. They slapped the cat in the carrier and loaded them out. The family was actually down in Denver. They worked in Denver. And it was actually the gentleman's medication that was in that pouch. So he didn't necessarily carry it with him all the time, but that was his plan to get medication as well. So I thought that was a great story about preparedness. So when we're talking about disaster plans, we want to make sure that we're recognizing unforeseen hazards, issues. If you have, for instance, flooding that may occur in your area, please make sure that you have people that are trained to handle that they've gone through appropriate training, they're certified. We don't want people that have never done that now all of a sudden are in a swift water situation where they could get swept away and don't have the capacity or the training to work their way out of it. And that goes for volunteers as well. So when we talk about, especially with Code 3, one of the great things about Code 3 and our response is that we make sure that all of our volunteers, our staff are trained to a certain level. If they do not have that certification or they're not trained up to that specification, they don't go out on those events. So they may have a different role in that event, and they may be sitting back at the office and helping administrate as opposed to respond out in the field. Make sure you're planning for spontaneous volunteers and you're planning for donations. Two of the huge issues that we can run into, and we did run into in this most recent Marshall Fire event. Establish local networks, and I think we're really good about that. I'm not going to harp on it here in Colorado because I just get so impressed by the way that we seamlessly work together, and I think AWAC helps facilitate that. I think Coffee and Collaboration helps facilitate that. And I think we're just really good about that in this community. So this was another polling question that I had. What year did the Pets Evacuation Transportation Standards Act go into effect? And I'm going to see what everybody thought. Oh, the majority thought 2009, 35%. Well, let me actually give you the answer. It was 2006. So the Pets Act, sorry, my computer's acting up. Give me just half of a second, please, guys. There we go. The Pets Act actually made a federal mandate that we needed to have plans, we needed to prepare, and we needed to actually follow up with household pets and service animals during events. So we couldn't just leave them behind. And this was right on the heels of Hurricane Katrina. So that's why this whole disaster preparedness started becoming an issue and started becoming at the forefront of our mind, and why I think it's still really relevant and important topic for us to be talking about, because it keeps rearing its ugly head several times a year, unfortunately, for us here in Colorado. So now we get to the nitty-gritty of the response. Those are the operations that we're doing with the evacuation, the rescuing, and housing. However, as I continue to talk about this, those are not the only three aspects that we're talking about when we're talking about a response. These are generally the types of issues that we're going to be dealing with, thinking about, and addressing. So scene assessment, animal documentation, again, volunteer management, that keeps rearing its ugly head. Animal transportation, sheltering is a big piece of that component. And then disposition and placement. You guys can read the rest. I don't need to go through all those for you. So 2 things to remember, and these are huge takeaways. Do not wait to ask for assistance. It generally takes time to rally volunteers and many times staff members as well, which means it takes time for help to get to you. So if you have the inkling that you're going to need assistance, please pull the trigger and ask for it. And do not start a rescue until you've established a safe shelter to house animals. We have a great story back in the floods, and it didn't involve me. It was actually one of my teammates, Garrett Leonard. They had been called out to help rescue some horses, and they were supposed to go to Adams County Shelter. And so he and his team went out there, they loaded up a bunch of horses, they transported them to Adams County Shelter, and Adams County Shelter is like, yeah, we're not open for sheltering. I don't know what you're doing. And so he sat there, and meanwhile, other horses that they could have saved are still out in the floodwaters, and they had to formulate a whole new plan of where to take these animals. And so that not only wasted resource, time, compromised animals, but it just was ineffective. So always, please, 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 you have a place to shelter the animals before you start removing them out of there. So when we're talking about shelters, one of the things that I think is great about at least Boulder that I'm aware of, and I think HSPPR does the same. And when we know that there's a disaster, I call up Jan and I say, hey, we have a disaster, we have a fire, we have whatever. We will be starting to bring animals in. And what they do is transport animals out of their shelter, those adoptable animals, to Dumb Friends League or to another shelter that is most likely not affected, to free up space. And that has worked seemingly well and has just been a lifesaver. And I share that story with many people across the country, and they have started to adopt those same policies. And recently in Kentucky, they did the same. So I think it's really cool that we're starting to build these networks of helping each other out, especially during these disasters or events. So when we're talking about sheltering site, are we going to use the same shelter that we have, like Humane Society of Boulder Valley or HSPPR or DFL? Or are we going to have to expand that? So are we going to have to look for a different shelter facility? Many times when we're doing co-located, it's like at the YMCA. If you have to, and we have this airline hangar, which we had to use as like a staging point during the floods, which was fine. But I really recommend if you try to avoid open field at all costs, just because then you're losing the ability to secure the facility. It's more personnel that you have to take care of the animals. So that's my little 2 cents on that. Moving on. So staffing various locations. So when we're responding, so during that response phase, you need somebody to be at the Emergency Operations Center. That's your central hub of communication with all the other entities. So with law enforcement, with your public information officer, with fire departments, it's really crucial that you have someone sitting in the EOC that's in the middle of that. You'll probably have somebody at Incident Command so that you know what's going on at Incident Command and you can check in and that you're working operations together. And then you'll have your evacuation team. You may have a team that's at your co-located or cohabitated shelter. And then you still have responders that are responding to calls for service. And I think that's something that we don't necessarily think about, but we still have animals that are biting people and that are still running around, and injured animals. And so there's still that component of we have to handle business. This was in the floods, and you'll see feet back here behind this bear. This was an alleyway in the city. And we had wildlife, of course, roaming around, so that we were receiving calls. Hey, there's these bears wandering around. What should we do? And so that's a human safety issue, which we had to make sure that we had designated officers to respond over and make sure everything was okay. So as far as staffing, don't underestimate the number of staff needed. However, don't overestimate as well. Really match what you need to the people. So if you need somebody to respond for calls for service and you guys are getting 10 calls a day, maybe one person can handle that. Don't call in your entire staff of 6. And then you want to make sure that you're briefing staff and volunteers about the event. It's important to include them and get them up to speed on what's going on. And please watch for burnout. One of the things, and I think that, sorry, I'll skip ahead for just a second, plan for turnover. And that goes back to know how many people you need, because you're going to have that turnover and people will need breaks and people will need a day off. And so you want to make sure that you have enough staff lined up that you can facilitate that. Now going back to watch for the burnout, also watch for how the impact that event is for that person. We have our staff and we have to do what we have to do. But for instance, during the flood, I had one employee whose parents actually lived up the canyon, and they were cut off from, any type of communication. And it was something where he was doing his due diligence, and he was working and he was helping rescue animals and all of those good things. But I could tell he was really, something was eating at him. And finally I took him aside and I said, what's going on with you and what do you need? And he said, I need to know that they're okay. And I said, then you need to go up there and find out that they're okay. And so he actually had to go up on foot because you couldn't drive up the canyon. And he drove up as far as he could, and then he got out on foot and he walked up the rest of the way to his parents' house. And his dad's like, what, you came all the way up here and you didn't bring me diesel? And he was like, okay, peace out, Dad. And then he came back down and he was like, they're okay, I can work now. So I think it's things like that, and then he was a workhorse after that. So I think it's things like that, recognizing what our employees need and maybe allowing them that opportunity to step away or do what needs to be done so they can get their head back in the game. And communication is essential. Why is it so important? Puma. My husband always tells me Puma. So is it this kind of Puma? Or is it this kind of Puma? And I can only imagine what you guys are thinking, because you're like, what in the heck does that mean? And this is what he says: please use more acronyms. So whenever I'm doing my law enforcement or my disaster response talk and I'm saying ICS and MOUs, he'll say to me Puma, which is my cue to time out, use some plain language. And so I think that is really important, especially when we're dealing with volunteers in different aspects of fire and law enforcement. We may not all speak the same language, so it's best to use plain language. So in the response, safety concerns, do not become the victim. And I'm talking about personal safety as well as public safety and animal safety. The personal safety of the responder is always the number one priority. We don't need you hurt, because then not only are you hurt, and that's horrible, we don't ever want to see that, but then that also takes you away from your mission and you're unable to continue to carry that out and assist with the disaster. Make sure that you and your staff and your volunteers have proper PPE, which is personal protective equipment. I'm trying not to use any acronyms that I'm not spelling out in this presentation. Proper training, current vaccinations, and then make sure that there's safeguards in place for public safety. A lot of times we'll set up, or law enforcement will set up barricades to not allow the public back into damaged areas or areas that could be dangerous. And then we'll see, spontaneous volunteers weave their way through or go on the back way and get back into those situations. In those situations, there's not a lot we can do about it. But on the front end, we certainly need to make sure that we're doing our best to prevent those people from getting in and getting hurt. And I can't stress enough, animal behavior in the field and in a disaster is not the same as in a controlled setting. So that animal, when it's loose in the house and now we're walking in as strangers trying to capture it or control it or, contain it in some way, that animal's behavior is not going to be the same as what it is for when the owner's sitting there petting it on the couch, on a Tuesday night. So safety and removal considerations, some things that we really need to think about when you're talking about power lines, flood waters, could you get swept away? Not only that, but also the contamination in those waters. all things that we need to be thinking about as responders. Can we safely get in and assist those animals and make sure that we're safe and the animal's safe and the community safe? And I just think it's a pretty cool picture. So biosecurity and biosafety, again, we're really starting to talk a lot more about decontamination and the importance of decontamination, not only in disasters and floodwaters, but also when we're in hoarding houses and those types of unsanitary conditions. And something to think about, do you and your facility, your organization have anything in place to decontaminate animals as they're coming in? That was a big discussion about the most recent Marshall fire. Is we have all these animals coming in to not only the fairgrounds, and so now they're covered in ash and soot and who knows what else is in those chemicals from those burned down houses, but now they're being housed together, they're licking each other, grooming each other. You know, what does that do? And should we have maybe set up a decontamination site? Probably, but not necessarily something that we think about right away. And so I think it at least now is allowing us the opportunity to start thinking about it and start having those conversations. But when we pull animals out of a house like this, are we just bringing them to the shelter and putting them in a kennel and walking away? Or should we maybe be washing them off and then putting them in the kennel? So I think some things that we should start to think about. And our decontamination, I had a great old picture that was kind of horrific because it has these people with the dog on the catch pole and they're like spraying the dog down, trying to decontaminate it. But these are some new, this is actually like a big horse trough tub that now we are using for decontamination purposes. So some really great things that are being put out there. This is another livestock system that was just developed. We actually have two of the only ones in the country here in Colorado, owned by a couple of the team members from Code 3. But we have the access to these resources now. And yes, for those of you that love chickens, I had to throw the chicken picture in there. We can even decontaminate chickens. Dilution is always the best solution for any type of water soluble contamination. One of the things that I learned during the Marshall fire is that we actually can decontaminate by using vacuum systems as well. So instead of spraying the animals off in cold freezing temperatures, you can either blow them off or vacuum them off, which I think the vacuuming is probably the way to go and probably what I should have been saying instead of blowing them off. But then that way you're actually sucking up those contaminants from that animal. Veterinary assessment and care. Ensure that you also have access to a veterinarian, either in the field, at a staging point, at the shelter location, or on call. One of the things with Code 3 is most of the time, I would say in probably 90% of the disasters we respond to, we actually have a veterinarian that goes with us out in the field, which is a huge resource. And although she may be teamed up with another team out in the field, of course, we could call her if we ever had an issue or situation and she could come and meet us. In the floods, we actually had a veterinarian on standby. We had one at the shelter as well, but we had one on standby. So when they were getting pulled off of the helicopters, we had a veterinarian that could look them over. And these were two dogs that actually came out of the flood that had a pretty significant injury to a hind leg. Another thing you need to think about is planning for unexpected challenges. When we were dealing with the Boulder floods, we ended up with the National Guard going out in helicopters and rescuing animals and people. So they were just loading them all up and bringing them back. Well, on day 3, I had the lieutenant colonel that was in charge of incident command. He comes marching through the airport hangar, and it's like the parting of all the law enforcement and military, and he's not a large man in stature. However, just his presence is immense. And he comes stomping right up to me and stops like right in front of my face and says, are you the person in charge of these animal operations? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, we had 2 animals die yesterday, and that's not going to happen again. So I need you to train my people, and we need to figure this out. And so we did ready in time training, and we pulled all of the equipment that they would need, including these actual real carriers, and showed them how to use leashes, showed them how to scruff cats, showed them how to actually properly put animals in crates, gave them a couple catch poles if they needed that, some muzzles. So we actually provided them with those, not only the equipment, but minimal skills to be able to navigate through this situation and get out on the other end safely. So volunteer management is a big one. I think we really need to focus on, because animals are such a big, they pull on our heartstrings, and we have such an outpouring from our communities about animals, and we want to volunteer and we want to save the animals. It's really something that we need to focus on the front end and figure out a solution to, so that when that disaster strikes, we don't run into a bunch of issues. So if you can have a core group of volunteers that you've already pre-identified, they're trained, they have a task that they have to go in, that's great. Then when you have those spontaneous volunteers show up, you can refer them to a volunteer center, give them, take their contact information and give them some other resource, and then say thanks, but no thanks. Because it's really about the management of them, because they can make it absolute chaos. And then donation management can be the same thing. Really, on the very forefront of any disaster, what we should be communicating through our public information officer is, if you need to evacuate, where they need to go, bring your animals and the location that they can bring their animals to, and then any type of donations. And if there's any issue with, we don't need volunteers, thank you, we already have groups out that are handling this situation. And I think that's something that we need to be really consistent about having happen on the very front end. So of course, the best idea is to always have like these palletized, shrink wrapped donations. I think the best thing is always monetary, because we get inundated with so much bags of dog food and blankets and old crates and those types of things. It's really best if we can communicate what we need is money, and then we can go buy what we need if we don't have it. So would you rather have this disaster this is like the disaster within the disaster, or something like this? So demobilizing and final debriefing, once you kind of come down from this event, you're cleaning, putting away equipment. Hopefully you're debriefing with your volunteers and your staff, lessons learned, kind of a hot wash of the entire event. Suggestions for improvement. What can we do better next time? What did we do great this time? And I really think it's important that we talk about critical incident stress debriefing as well. Some of these events really hit home, and when you have friends or loved ones that are impacted, perhaps you need to provide that support with your volunteers or your employees, where they need to talk to somebody. So then we talk about recovery, and that's really fixing everything, right? Like coming back to that sense of normal. So we talk about public assistance programs and returning to normal operations. It's those people being able to go and get temporary housing until hopefully their home can be rebuilt. How can we support them in the animal welfare field, as far as, a big one right now is veterinary care. So these people have lost their homes, they've lost everything. They may need veterinary care, maybe not right now, but in 6 months from now. So how can we provide that and facilitate that for them? Or are there other things that they may need as well? And then we talk about returning to a normal operation. So this is kind of after everything's happened, we recover our equipment, we may have to purchase some new, kind of get everything back in order. We rebuild everything that has kind of been thrown about for the last, 5-10 month days. And And we really, another thing that I wanted to talk about is the impacts on personal lives as well. And it goes back to that critical stress debriefing. And I think it's something that we kind of gloss over, but there is impact to personal lives. And sometimes our responders are also the ones impacted by disasters. And my personal story is that when we had the Boulder floods, my house actually flooded during that incident as well. And thank goodness I have a great support system. And, you know, my husband called me up, and I think I was standing out with a helicopter in the background. And he's like, we have a problem. The basement's flooding. And I said to him, well, I have a helicopter landing. You have to deal with that right now. I'll hopefully see you tonight. And so some things that we need to be thinking about when we're having to deal with those types of issues. So the disposition and adoption of animals during this most recent event, I think we kind of had the standard, we're going to hold everything for 2 weeks on a stray hold if we didn't have an owner, just so that we could make sure that we could get those animals home. I think in Colorado, we're really good about doing that. We have the latitude to be able to extend that and fluctuate that as needed. I think during the floods, I know that we had some animals that actually went to long-term foster for upwards of 2 months. And that may be the same situation here for this fire, because, you know, these people don't have homes, or maybe they are staying with relatives and the animals don't get along. So they do need some type of long-term foster in place. And then these are just some cool cards that I wanted to share that were sent to us and from some kids that I just thought was really cool. And that's all I have for today, guys. Sorry, I ran into 45 minutes.
Janae, thank you so much. There's so much information here. We really appreciate the time you took to prepare this. I want to invite all of you to begin putting questions in the chat. I'm sure that there are many. And I'll start, Janae, with a question. For those organizations, because we know that a number of the attendees today were animal care, you know, shelters, rescues. For those organizations that aren't already connected to an incident command like network, you know, but you want to offer services, you want to start, you know, being involved in the planning process for your community, where should they start? Who should they contact first?
Well, I think you start with those people that are already connected. So if you have animal control in your area, which most everybody does in the state of Colorado, that's really where you start, is by reaching out to them and saying, hey, I have this resource we can offer you, or hey, how can I fit into this fold? And start that communication. That could be animal control, or it could be that local shelter. Instead of going to Jefferson County Animal Control, maybe you start at Foothills and say, hey, how can we help out?
And then do you have resources for those organizations that are, you know, doing the preparedness, the planning for a disaster? Are there already groups or trainings out there for people who are volunteering to or want to volunteer in the event of a disaster? Or do you have any resources you could share with us as far as that?
Absolutely. So Code 3, of course, offers training for volunteers, responders, and it can be, you know, as simple as awareness training. So just to get you on the level of, oh, this is what you need to be aware of with disaster animal sheltering, to actual technical animal rescue. So we do provide those types of training services. We also provide the service to be able to review people's disaster plans. So if your organization has a disaster plan, or maybe you don't have a disaster plan and you're like, I need help figuring this out, you always can reach out to me. And I generally will loop in Eric Thompson, who is our executive director, and he kind of heads up the evaluations of organizations and their disaster plans, and he can review that, and we are happy to help you out with that.
Thanks. So you spoke a little bit about how to kind of help manage volunteers in the event of a disaster. I think you encouraged us to think ahead about what is your response going to be to the influx of volunteers. What advice or guidance do you have on those people who self-deploy or who just can't seem to take no for an answer when it comes to volunteering in a natural disaster or other circumstance? It sounds like some of our attendees experienced that behavior during the Marshall Fire and struggled with, how to say no.
Yeah, and I think, for one, if you have a plan in place, so like in the very onset, if you can say, okay, do we have somebody within these groups of all of these entities, so between human housing and law enforcement and fire, do we have a group that's actually dealing with volunteers? If we can redirect them to that group, and then that group can say, okay, we don't want you to self-deploy to go find cats out in the field, but we need this, we need you to answer phones, and that's really important, then do that. You just have to say no. You have to tell them no. And I think what we've seen across the country with these disasters is many times law enforcement has to get involved, because you have these people that interject, and they are truly a menace and an issue when it comes to safety and rescue operations. And they're taking pets, from that may not even be lost or that aren't being rescued. And then they're like taking them to a shelter, 40 miles away, or they're taking them to a foster 40 miles away. So that really becomes an issue. And I've heard of some jurisdictions that will actually intervene, and they will issue them a trespass order and say, get out of here, next time you're going to be arrested. And I think, we have the tendency to kind of back off and say, well, they're well-meaning. Well, not necessarily. Some of them are very self-serving.
We have one question, if you are aware of any data to indicate whether decontamination efforts during rescuing animals is worth the time and efforts it takes in all situations. So what data is out there that you've seen that is bringing up this decontamination conversation?
So it's really happened more at a national level. So the military came to a couple of our team members and said, look, if we have some type of massive event, we need to know how to decontaminate. And at the time it was like 50,000 animals. And we're like, okay, time out. How about we try to figure out how to decontaminate 50? And so we started that conversation with them. And I don't know that I have necessarily hard stats that say you need to do it, but I think it's the same as, right? Like we go out, we're messing around in dirt and fire. You come in and you wash your hands. You don't, and yet we don't do that for pets. And so it's a matter of just getting that stuff off and making sure that they're clean and healthy and they have that debris off of them. And especially when we're talking about fires where you have chemicals that now have melted into the soil and melted into the ash and are floating around, or floodwaters where you have the same, you have household chemicals in water and the animals are swimming around with it, as are you. When we get back at night, we're taking a shower. It only seems to make sense that we would do the same for the pets so that they're not spreading that.
Hey, Janae.
Yes.
It's Eric. You may want to remind the group that there is a animal decon best practice work group paper at the NASEP.com. And it's NASEP, it's an acronym. Think about NASA AEP. And that work group is reconvening to kind of compile data because, again, Janae nailed it. Depending on your contaminant, whether you're radiological, whether it's wildfire ash, or whether it's an oil contaminant, and the type of animal, depending on feathers, fur, hair coat, it gets quite complicated. But there are lots of papers clear back to the 90s that show the necessity of removing contaminant for not only people's health, but the animal's health.
Could you repeat that website one more time and I'll put it in the chat?
Sure. It's the NASEP, and NASEP acronym is NASAAEP.com. And when you get there, there's a library or a link for resources, and it'll take you to the white paper library that has everything from emergency sheltering to ASAR to animal decon to transportation in it.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay. We're at 9:23. We have about 7 more minutes, which is not quite enough time for us to go in any kind of breakout groups. So let's just continue the conversation here. If there are any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask them directly to Janae.
Or we can do song and dance, interpretive, if you'd like. Anna, I see you nodding your head. I think that you're volunteering.
Hey, Janae, can you send out a copy of your slides?
Absolutely. I would be happy to share those.
That would be very helpful. Thank you. Good job. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, Doug. Another thing that I do have is a worksheet that I didn't include in the presentation, but I would be happy to share with Jennifer, and then maybe if you want to send it out to everybody. But it's an actual like facility evaluation of your own facility, or you can even do it for your personal home. And it just goes through all the steps of what do you have? How prepared are you? Do you have these items in place? And so I'm happy to share that too, if anybody's interested.
Yeah, that would be great.
Please share, Janae, and we can send it to all of our attendees.
Perfect.
Today. Yeah, in our follow-up. I think there's a lot of us out there who are, really trying to, it's a little bit overwhelming, right? To think about how our organizations might be called upon to help in a disaster situation. And it's helpful to have some of those lists to at least start the conversation, both within the organization and with those partners in the area. And I, just in listening to your presentation, I loved the way you highlighted how, many shelters in Colorado already have these partnerships in place to say, hey, if a disaster hits our community, which other organizations can we reach out to help us with, our current animal population, those animals that are in our adoption programs, move them out to other places in the community that aren't impacted, and make room for those animals that are impacted by the disaster. So if your organization doesn't yet have those partnerships in place, that's a really great place to start.
It is. It really, just developing partnerships. And one of my roles in Code 3 is now to develop those partnerships with Code 3 and other organizations across the state, because we want, we don't want to come in and take over your operation. That's not our intent. Our intent is to come in and help in whatever capacity we can. And we do have the people that are trained to do that. We do have that expertise. And so, heck, you have a hoarding issue, we're happy to come in and help, remove animals or set up temporary shelter, any of those types of things. And, I want everybody in this call and across the state of Colorado to realize that that's what we're here to help with too.
I'll ask one more question that came up for me as I was listening, Janae. You were talking about the personnel required, to staff the different, either co-housing locations or over at the incident command. And, obviously when you have a disaster, there's this period of all hands on deck. But one of the things you also think about is just the resources. If it's employees you have to send, if you don't have a volunteer force trained to participate, and you do have to send your employees, you start thinking about the cost, right? It can be expensive too. And I think for many of our organizations, there's some hope that we can, we'll have some donations that will help with that. But are you aware of other resources that rescues and shelters can request in the event of a disaster and the need to, have this outpouring of additional expenditures?
So I think there's a couple of great foundations that will help. I know ASPCA provided a bunch of money for IDA, Maddie's fund. There are those types of organizations. And if we're talking about like a federally declared event, you are eligible for refund from the federal government. So I certainly can provide that information as well in some paperwork that you can share out to the group too. But if that is a declared event, then FEMA will step in and interject and and help reimburse some costs. And that does include volunteer hours as well.
Awesome. Curious if there's any other questions out there as we wrap up this morning. Okay. Well, we're going to give you 1 minute back in your day. Janae, thank you so much. This was a really thoughtful and very informative presentation. And I think it's helped a lot of us to, if we don't already have these plans in place, to at least start thinking about what we need to be thinking about. So thank you, Janae.
Absolutely. And thank you guys so much. And thanks for hanging in there with me and engaging and listening. It's just such an important topic and I really appreciate it. And my hat's off to everything that you all do for animals and people in Colorado.
Hope you all have a great morning.
Bye, guys.